we have this JSON type structure up here, and it is automatically synced with app.state. Pretty cool. But Firebase can do more than that. It can also do authentication.
Quick question, when you're trying to resolve that, did you remove package.lock?
No. Let's see here. So let's think a little bit about authentication. What we want to happen is for people to be able to click something, sign in, and then maybe we can scope their notes by their username. We've scoped things by other things before, right? We added the categories late in the game to Jeffervescence, the genres or whatever, or years or whatever it is you did. So we could do something very similar. So instead of just having notes here, basically the structure would be something like, you know, some user ID, and then that points to an object which has notes, which then have IDs and so on. So if we could do something like that, that would be pretty cool. And we know that Firebase has some sort of authentication available to us. So let's go away from the database section real quick and go to authentication and see what it says. Authenticate and manage users from a variety of providers without server-side code. Set up sign-in method. Let's do it. All right, so we can do email, password, phone, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, anonymous login. We all have GitHub user accounts, so I'm going to choose GitHub for right now. So if I click that, I get this. And there's an enable button, so let's click enable. To complete setup, add this authorization callback URL to your GitHub app configuration. Learn more. So we can read more about how to do it, or I can just show you. But it is important that you copy this URL here and use the little button they give you to do it. Otherwise, you might select something that isn't visible, but that is there. I've seen it happen basically every time someone doesn't use that button. So if I go into Note Herder here, this might be on my, this is in my user settings. So on my user settings, click your little avatar in the upper right, hit settings on GitHub. And on the left, you see developer settings, OAuth applications. So the authentication in Firebase uses a standard called OAuth. And I'm going to register a new application. And this is Note Herder S2 morning. Homepage URL, you must fill this out. If you don't know a URL for it really yet, you could say, you know, your GitHub pages thing for that. So let's see, that would be XTBC 17s2.github.io/NoteHerder. Description is optional, and then the callback URL. This is the magic. So you need to paste that URL in that you copied from Firebase, and then register the application. And then at the top, you will see client ID and client secret. And back in Firebase, it just happens to want to know the client ID and client secret. So copy those over. Oops. All right. So now GitHub is enabled. GitHub authentication.
So for the homepage URL on GitHub, is that the project that you're doing, or is that just like your homepage to your
Yeah.
profile?
It doesn't really matter. It's not optional. You have to put something. If you actually had it deployed somewhere, you would put the real URL there. And when we do, we can do that. And notice underneath, there's also authorized domains. So if you want to deploy this somewhere and have it authenticate correctly, you need to add an authorized domain for that. But by default, it does trust localhost and firebaseapp.com. So how do we use it? It used to be that Rebase made this really easy too, but Rebase no longer supports authentication. He wanted to just focus it on that whole sync state business. So we have to actually use the Firebase Off API a little bit. Thankfully, that's very easy. And we'll just do it back in base.js. So we need to import an extra thing. At the top, just import Firebase/auth. We don't need to put from anything. We don't need to give it a name. We don't need to actually make a reference to it. Just importing this will add something to the Firebase object. And our initialized app will then have an auth method on it. So after we make our reference to the database, but before we export default, we need to call app.auth like that. And really we're going to have to make a reference to this in another file somewhere, so we need to export this as well. So we're exporting more than one thing now. So it's going to have to be a named export. So we'll save this to a variable, const auth equals app auth. And then just throw an export at the beginning of that line. Export const auth equals app auth. And then it'll be a named export called auth. Similarly, we need a reference to the GitHub authentication provider inside Firebase. And this is all pretty well documented in the Firebase API. Here's the line I'm going to add. I'll throw that in Slack real quick. It was a jerk. So this Firebase.auth is there because we imported in Firebase Off. And underneath that, there's a function called GitHub Auth Provider, a constructor called GitHub Auth Provider. So we instantiate that, save it to this, and export that as a named export. So then we can get to it from another file. Yeah, Brandon.
By the way, did that work? Removing left out?
Kind of. It's not getting the stuff from the database up there. Like, it didn't get the new.
Okay, but it'll start your application.
Yes, it'll start and it'll save it.
How do you work that?
Delete the lock.
And then leave those modules completely in the folder here.
Okay. To delete the folder node on modules.
Delete the whole node modules folder. Yeah.
So what we want to do is add a whole sign in, sign out flow to our application. What do I have unsaved here? I'm not sure I believe it. Oh yeah, that crap. So let's not worry about how to actually use these things yet. Let's just make sign in, sign out components and try to make them work. And hard code something in. So I'm going to create a new component. I'm going to call it sign in. So capital S, capital I, sign in.js. May as well create sign in.css too. And I'll make this a stateless functional component. So we need to import React, of course, from React.
You're in CS.
Thanks. I'll import my CSS in here. Const sign in equals arrow function. Export default, sign in. Then this will just return some JSX. I'm going to make a button with a class of sign in. Not gamepad button. What? And I'll make this button say sign in with GitHub. It's our, we've got this blue color that's kind of our theme color here. So I'm going to throw in a little CSS for this. I'll copy and paste it into Slack once I see if it looks okay. And let's just try sticking our sign in component somewhere. For right now, in main, I suppose. Because we don't want anything outside of that, really. So we'll just put it, yeah, maybe we could put it at the top of the sidebar or something. The sidebar isn't very wide, is it? I'll put it at the top of the form. Or the list, sure. This isn't its final resting place, so. Above the H3 for notes, I will put in sign in and make sure I import it. See what that looks like? Doesn't look like a gosh darn thing. Yay, that's a little big, I'm going to say. So let's tweak this a little bit. Width, 400 pixels. Yeah, we don't need to probably specify the width at all.
Where'd you copy that CSS from?
Something I wrote before. That shadow's a little goofy on this. Probably with that background color, the color should be white. And this is temporary anyway. So that's good enough for now. So here is that CSS. So the idea is when we click sign in, something's going to happen that indicates to our app that we're signed in. And we're going to save something on state that indicates that. And we're going to have a sign out component as well. And that's only going to show up if we're already signed in. And this one is only going to show up if we're not signed in. So let's go ahead and make that other component. Sign out. .js. I suppose we can put sign out .css. So sign out is also going to be a stateless functional component. Import React from React. Let's import our CSS. Yeah, what folder did it make this in? It made it in the right place. Const sign out equals arrow function. Export default sign out. And let's return a button that looks an awful lot like that other one. Sign out. And we'll just have the text sign out. And the idea is that only one of these is going to show up at any given time. So we need some way to keep track of whether we're signed in or not. So for right now, on app.js, I want to add a method called signed in that'll return true or false. And I don't know how to implement that yet, so temporarily, I'm going to make it return true all the time. You know what? Maybe it's worth making this ugly not to have to go down so many levels to get to these darn buttons. Let's see. Note list. What if I take this out of here and just stick it inside app right before main? Let's see here. Import sign in from sign in. Import sign out from sign out. And I'll just put sign in here for right this second and see what happens. Okay, it's ugly, but we know it's temporary, so we'll live with it. And the idea is that's only going to show up if we are signed in, right? I mean, if we're signed out. And in fact, if we're not signed in, the sign in button should be the only thing that shows up. Even main shouldn't show up unless we're signed in, right? Because you won't have access to any notes. So we could do something like this. We could make a method we'll call render main. And all it will do is return. We'll make it a div because we have to have some outer element that contains everything else. And it'll have the sign out button. And main. So by doing that, we can very easily write a quick ternary to show the one we want. So inside this div class name app, I'm going to put a JavaScript expression, so I need my curly braces. I'm going to say this dot signed in, because that returns true or false. Use a ternary. If it's true, if we are signed in, then I want to call this dot render main. Otherwise, I want the sign in component. You can just put JSX here. It's just like calling React.createElement. See how that works? Assuming that the value of signed in does something. So looking now, there's our sign out button. It doesn't have any style on it. So heck, maybe we just leave out the style for those two things because that's actually better. It's ugly, but it's better. I'll just get rid of sign in CSS. Sign in CSS is all right. So what if it were false? I'll temporarily change signed in to just return false all the time so we can have a look at what we see. And we see nothing but the sign in with GitHub button. Now we want clicking those buttons to actually change it, right? Without knowing anything about how this stuff from Rebase actually works, or from Firebase, I should say, we could at least make it do something. Yeah. With the render, yeah, sure. That little ternary. Yeah. Go ahead and make a quick commit for adding these components, even though they don't do what we want yet.